Picture this. It's the spring of 1973, and pro stock drag racing is going through one of those quiet revolutions that only insiders notice while it's happening. A man named Leonard Abbott has built a planetary clutchless transmission called the Lenco, and the racers who bolt one in are picking up tenths overnight. Up and down pit row, everyone's talking about the same thing. Faster, easier, cleaner. Everybody gets a tenth, sometimes more. Everybody except one guy. There's exactly one pro stock car in the country that runs slower with the Lenco than without it. Slower by 0.04 of a second. The driver of that car is a soft-spoken kid from the textile country of central North Carolina. His name is Ronnie Sox, and what happened in that one little number, that 0.04 of a second, is the answer to a question the whole sport had been refusing to ask for the better part of 3 years. That question was simple. How can one man drive a stick shift so well that the rule book itself has to be rewritten to stop him? This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the men and machines that broke motorsport wide open before anyone realized it was happening. If you're someone who loves the raw, mechanical era of drag racing, the 4-speed cars, the factory wars, the drivers who were as much a part of the machine as the engine itself, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because this is the story of how a quiet kid who pumped gas at his daddy's Sinclair station became the human transmission. How he and his partner Buddy Martin built the most famous team in drag racing. And how their dominance got so total, so absolutely uncontested, that the NHRA admitted on the record they had to change the rules to give the rest of the field a fighting chance. This is the story of Ronnie Sox, and how he broke drag racing. To understand why Ronnie Sox mattered, you have to understand what drag racing looked like before he arrived. In the late 50s and into the early 60s, this was a sport that ran on shade tree hot rodders and factory politics. The big three were finally taking it seriously. Ford had its total performance program. Chevrolet had its 409 and then its 427. Chrysler had the Max Wedge and was about to drop the 426 Hemi. The match race circuit was paying real money, and the win on Sunday, sell on Monday era was at full boil. But here's the thing nobody tells you about that era. Almost every serious door car ran a 4-speed manual. The clutch and the shifter weren't just controls. They were the bottleneck. Cars made monstrous power for the time, but turning that power into a quarter-mile pass meant a driver had to do 3 things in about 5 seconds. He had to launch off the line without smoking the tires. He had to power shift through 3 gear changes at full throttle without shattering a transmission. And he had to do all of it while keeping the front end pointed straight down a strip that was usually nothing more than a country airport with a Christmas tree at one end. Most drivers were okay at it. A few were good. A handful were really good. And one guy was about to be so far above everybody else that the whole class would have to be redesigned around his absence. But in 1958, he was just a teenager pulling a 348 Chevy out of a customer's car at his father's filling station in Burlington, North Carolina. Willard Ronald Sox was born December 17, 1938, in the Burlington-Greensboro area of central North Carolina. His daddy Willard ran Sox Sinclair on Church Street in Burlington, and Ronnie started working the pumps when he was 11 years old. The family had deep Alamance County roots in the area, the same region sometimes called the Whiskey Belt. Like a lot of kids in that part of the country in that era, he learned about cars by listening to Moonshine Runners and learned about engines by tearing them apart. Before he was even old enough to drive legally, his daddy bought him a 1932 Plymouth Coupe, and that was the car he learned to feel a clutch on. By 1958, he was pulling the 348 V8 out of a customer's 58 Chevy, modifying it, and putting it back. He took that car to a little bracket race that the Burlington Police Club was running at a local airport and won it. Then he won the next one, and the next. The Sox and Martin official history says he won 48 straight races and was the track champion. By 1960, he was driving a Pontiac that was being prepared with help from Ray Nichols Engineering, the NASCAR shop. By 1962, he was wheeling a '62 Dodge with the 413 Max wedge, with Mr. 413 lettered on the front fenders and Sox Sinclair on the back. He was 23 years old, and he was already the guy to beat in the Carolinas. That same year, a man named Buddy Martin started showing up to races with his own 409 Chevy and getting beaten every time by Ronnie. Martin was a railroad guy who had worked for Norfolk and Western and saved his money around the Burlington textile mills. He had a '58 Corvette, some cash and ambition. Every time Ronnie beat him for the win, Martin would offer him a deal. "Drive my car for the consolation prize." Ronnie did it. He was making a few extra dollars and Martin was watching. At the end of 1962, Martin pitched him the deal that would change both their lives. "I am ordering a new '63 Chevy with the Z11 and a 427. You drive it." They won the first time out in January 1963. And as Buddy Martin put it years later in his low-key way, "I couldn't beat Ronnie, so I joined him." That's how Sox and Martin started. Not as partners in any legal sense. Martin owned the cars and ran the business and pulled the deals together. Sox drove. The setup never changed for the rest of their working lives. In 1964, General Motors pulled out of factory racing, and that left a hole. Mercury offered Martin a 427 high-riser Comet through Lincoln Mercury, and the team jumped. There were only 8 of those A/FX Comets built. The drivers handed the keys were Ronnie Sox, Tom Sturm, Dino Don Nicholson, and Hayden Profits. Sox took that Comet to the 1964 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona and beat Dino Don in the A/FX final on a hole shot. That's worth pausing on for a second. Dino Don Nicholson was already a legend, the guy with the 4-speed in the early 60s. Beating him in a final on the tree was not something most drivers in the country could do. Sox did it as a 25-year-old from a North Carolina filling station. The car ended up on the cover of Superstock magazine, and the team got picked to tour England that fall as part of the NHRA and U.S. racing team. Word got around. By the end of 1964, a Chrysler engineer named Dale Ricker was working a directive from racing director Bob Cahill. Find the best 4-speed manual driver in America. Ricker found Sox and Martin and signed them to Plymouth for 1965. That deal would last almost a decade. What Chrysler put in their hands in 1965 was a piece of work. 12 altered wheelbase A/FX cars were built. 6 Plymouth Belvederes and 6 Dodge Coronet. The rear axle was moved 15 inches forward and the front axle 10 inches forward, leaving a 110-inch wheelbase that put about 56% of the car's weight on the back tires. Power came from the A864 race Hemi running 12.5-to-1 compression. Initially they ran twin Holley 4-barrels and turned in 10.20s at 138. Once Hillborn fuel injection went on mid-season, they were running mid-9s at over 140. NHRA threw them out of A/FX almost immediately because nobody was going to call this a stock car. The Plymouth ad guys took it in stride. Their slogan that year was "If you can't beat them, outlaw them." But the match race money was already better than NHRA was paying anyway. On April 24, 1965, at the US 30 Strip in York, Pennsylvania, Sox dropped a 9.98 at 136 miles per hour in a car that came to be known as the Paper Tiger. First 9-second stalker on the East Coast. He was 26 years old. In 1966, Chrysler let them try a funny car. A nitro-alcohol-injected Hemi under a fiberglass Barracuda body called the Cuda. Sox ran 8.70 seconds at over 150 and the team claimed 70 wins in 90 races, though that number is a team-supplied figure and unverified by anybody outside the operation. Late that year, Bob Cahill at Chrysler shut the program down with one of those lines that becomes legendary in retrospect. "The last time I checked, we don't sell fuel-altered funny cars." So Sox and Martin went back to door slammers, and that's where the legend really starts. From 1967 through 1971, they claimed the house in NHRA Super Stock. The 1967 Plymouth GTX took Sox to the Springnationals at Bristol, Tennessee. Then he did it again in 1968, and 1969, and 1970, and 1971. 5 Springnationals victories in a row. To this day, nobody else has won that race 5 years running. He won Super Stock Eliminator at the 1967 U.S. Nationals. He took the 1968 NHRA Super Stock World Championship in his Hurst-built Hemi Cuda. The car was a BO29 fastback factory-rated 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet on a 100-inch van seat with fiberglass front clip and lightweight glass. Sox ran 10.22 at 134 in trim, which forced the NHRA to reclassify the BO29 from Super Stock B to Super Stock A. Then he won the U.S. Nationals again in 1969 and took both the NHRA Super Stock World title and the NHRA World Championship that year. By the end of the 60s, he was the most dominant Super Stock driver in the country, and he hadn't even gotten to his best stuff yet. Here's what most people don't realize about Sox and Martin as a program. It wasn't just 2 guys with a race car. By the late 60s, they had a full professional operation. Jake King was the engine builder, hired in 1964, and he painted every single Hemi he built Ford blue so people would know it was his work. Carcraft magazine named him 1971 All-Star Mechanic of the Year. There was Dave Christie, the chassis builder, who did all the body-in-white prep at the Burlington shop. There was Tom Richardson, hired in 1967 from Hurst, who became the first full-time PR manager in drag racing history. The team had a road show called the Plymouth Super Car Clinic that toured 265 days a year, hitting dealerships across the country with Ronnie himself handling the driving techniques portion. As Sox told it later, the clinics gave the team the money to go first class on everything. By 1969, they had a second driver, Don Carlton, who had wrecked his own Hemi Cuda flat towing it, and Buddy Martin had essentially bought him the car and given him a job. They had Herb McCandless waiting in the wings. They had factory backing. They had the most professional operation in drag racing, and they were about to enter the era they were built for. Look, in late 1969, Buddy Martin, Bill Jenkins, Dino Don Nicholson, and Dick Landy went to the NHRA and asked for a heads-up class for door cars. The NHRA had been threatening to lock the big-name drivers into an exclusive deal, and NHRA didn't want to lose them. So in the October 31, 1969 issue of National Dragster, the NHRA announced a new pro class called Pro Stock. The rules were simple. Production body and weight. Production frame chassis. 2 carburetors on a tunnel ram. Gasoline only. 7 pounds of car for every cubic inch of engine. No car older than 3 model years. The first ever Pro Stock event was the 1970 Winter Nationals at Pomona, February 1970. Sox qualified number 1, 10.00 at 139. Bill Jenkins qualified number 2 in his 68 Camaro, 10.08 at 139. In round 1, Jenkins ran the first 9-second pass in Pro Stock history, a 9.98 at 138.46. The two of them met in the final. Jenkins took it 9.99 at 139.53, over Sox's 10.12. Now, if you're tracking this story, you might think the rivalry begins right there. Jenkins versus Sox, Chevy versus Mopar. And in a sense, it does. But here's what's important. Jenkins won the first event and the second event, the Gator Nationals. But over the course of 1970 and 1971, those would be 2 of the very few Pro Stock events Bill Jenkins would beat Sox and Martin. By the end of 1970, Sox had won 3 of 7 NHRA Pro Stock events. His teammate, Herb McCandless, had won the U.S. Nationals at Indy in a Sox and Martin Hemi Duster. and Sox was the first ever NHRA Pro Stock World Champion. He also won the 1970 NHRA Pro Stock Championship, and Drag News named him Pro and Super Stock Driver of the Year. That was the warm-up. 1971 is when he got biblical. The 1971 Cuda, the team called the Boss, was their masterpiece. Acid-dipped shell, ladder bar rear suspension, dual-plug Hemi heads with a magneto, ported Wind tunnel ram modified in-house, twin Holley 4500 dominators feeding the engine around 12.5 to 1 compression, transistorized ignition, Hurst short-throw shifter on a new process A833 4-speed, Dana 60 rear, Keystone Classic mags, Firestone slicks, about 3,000 pounds. At the 1971 Winter Nationals, Sox qualified number 1 with a 9.81 at 141.50, a class record. He won that event. Then he won the Gator Nationals. Then the Spring Nationals, his 5th in a row. Then the Grand National. Then the U.S. Nationals at Indy. Then the Super Nationals at Ontario. 6 of 8 NHRA Pro Stock events that year went to Ronnie Sox. The other 2 went to Dino Don Nicholson and Mike Fonz. Now there's a wrinkle here you have to know about. NHRA in those years awarded its World Championship to whoever won the World Finals, not on point. Just whoever turned on the win light at the year-end race. In 1971, Sox lost the World Finals to Mike Fonz in a Rod Shop Dodge Challenger. So technically, the 1971 NHRA Pro Stock World Championship belongs to Mike Fonz in the bookkeeping. Sox won everything else, but not that one. It's a quirk of the era worth flagging. And there was another wrinkle at Ontario. In the semi-final, Butch Leal turned on the win light against Sox in his Duster. But on teardown inspection, Leal's car came in at 57.2% rear weight bias when the limit was 55. Sox was reinstated. He went on to beat Herb McCandless in the final. Then his own car got protested. The NHRA brass had to clear it Monday afternoon after the trophy was already in the back of the truck. Drag racing drama was never subtle. By the end of 1971, the math was looking grim if you weren't running a Hemi. Sox and Martin had won 12 of the 15 NHRA Pro Stock finals across 1970 and 1971. Their cars were in the magazines every month. Tom Richardson had them on a publicity tour that included an invitation to the Nixon White House alongside Richard Petty. The Hemi-powered Sox and Martin Plymouths had become the New York Yankees of Pro Stock. And just like the Yankees, that meant other people in the room were starting to talk about how to bring them back to earth. The talk started inside NHRA. By the end of 1971, the field had shrunk to mostly Mopars. Ford had effectively walked away. General Motors was running on private Camaros and the occasional Vega. Manufacturers were complaining that there was no point in showing up if all you were doing was racing for second. The class was supposed to be a 4-brand draw. Instead, it was the Sox and Martin show. So at the end of 1971, NHRA changed the rules. The flat 7 pounds per cubic inch formula was thrown out. In its place came what they called weight break. Small block engines could now run 6.75 pounds per cube. Big block engines like the 426 Hemi were bumped up to 7.25. NHRA's official statement, which is on the record and worth repeating almost as plainly as they put it, was that they decided to implement weight breaks to encourage some other makes to get back into the program. That's the official line. The practical line was different. Bill Jenkins' small block 331 cubic inch Vega could now legally weigh as little as 2,200 pounds. Ronnie Sox's 426 Hemi Cuda was tipping the scales at over 3,100 pounds. Both engines made about the same horsepower per cubic inch. One car was 900 pounds lighter. This is where it gets really interesting, because Jenkins saw it coming and started building the answer in November of 1971. With Dave Trison, Larry Whitman, and Joe Kerr, He built what he later said took 1,400 man-hours. The first Pro Stock with a tube chassis, a 1972 Vega with a small block Chevy on Craigar wheels. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the rules changed and the better car won. That happens in racing all the time. But here's the thing. The rules didn't change because the racing produced a natural winner. The rules changed because one driver had made the existing rules irrelevant. There's a difference. When a sport rewrites its rulebook specifically to balance competition, what it's really saying is that one competitor has found a level of performance the system wasn't designed to accommodate. That's not a story about a rule change. That's a story about a driver so dominant that the governing body of his sport had to intervene to preserve the field around him. At the 1972 Winter Nationals, Jenkins qualified 17th out of 32 at a sandbagging 9.90. On race day, he was running 9.63 seconds. He beat Stu McDade in the early rounds and ran down Ronnie Sox in the final on a hole shot. As Bill Jenkins later said about the program, he was going to build the Vega whether NHRA went with a weight break format or not. He could have used it for match races. But of course NHRA did go with weight breaks and Jenkins did go to the Winter Nationals. And what he proceeded to do over the rest of 1972 was win 6 of 8 NHRA national events and the World Championship. Ronnie Sox was shut out of NHRA's winner's circle for the entire 1972 season. 12 of 15 finals won one year. 0 finals won the next. The team built a new acid-dipped Plymouth Duster for the 1972 season. Narrower than the Cuda, with a 16-plug Hemi block and magnesium Dana 60. The car was the most aggressive Pro Stock Mopar they ever built. By rule, it had to carry over 200 pounds more than a small block Vega. They were fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and they knew it. Their only 1972 win came at the NHRA US Open at Rockingham, North Carolina. For a team that had won 12 of 15 NHRA Pro Stock finals across the previous 2 seasons, one win at a regional event was not what any of them had in mind when they showed up at the Winter Nationals in February. But here's the thing about Ronnie Sox during this period. He didn't panic. He didn't switch to a small block. He didn't ask Chrysler to do something different with the car. He kept driving the Hemi because it was what he and the team knew, and because he genuinely believed the combination could be competitive again. That tells you something about the man. He wasn't calculating the angles. He was committed to his machine. Now this is where the story gets close to the question we started with. Because here's what was happening inside the sport. The talk on the pit row was that Sox would adapt. He always had. Jenkins thought so too. There was an assumption inside Pro Stock that he would be back in the winner's circle in 1973. He didn't get there, and the reason he didn't get there is the answer to everything. In the spring of 1973, a Connecticut machinist named Leonard Abbott started selling a transmission called the Lenco. It was a planetary clutchless gearbox, $4,000 apiece, which in 1973 dollars was about what a race engine cost. The pitch was simple. You stab a bar, the transmission shifts itself. No clutch foot. No missed gears. No money lost on the tree to a fumbled hand. It was, depending on how you looked at it, the death of a craft or the birth of a class. Pro Stock racers started bolting them in over the winter and into the spring, and the data was instant and unanimous. Bob Glidden picked up time. Wayne Gap picked up time. Don Nicholson picked up time. Bill Jenkins, who was already running a hot car, picked up time. Up and down the field, every Pro Stock entry got faster with the Lenco by as much as a tenth. Sox bolted one in. His car ran 400ths slower. Now, think about what that means. 400ths is a measurable, repeatable number. It's not noise. It's not a bad weather day. It's not a fluke. The whole field gets a tenth. One car gets 400ths slower. There is exactly one variable that has changed in that car. The driver is no longer doing the shifting, and the car is now 400ths slower. Here's what most people don't realize about that number. It doesn't just tell you that Ronnie Sox was a great driver. Numbers like that come up in sports all the time to describe great athletes. What it tells you is something much more specific. It tells you that Ronnie Sox's hands and feet were operating with greater mechanical efficiency than the best clutchless planetary transmission that American engineering could produce in 1973. He wasn't just driving the stick well. He was better than the machine built to replace him. He was the shift. He was the linkage. He was the human transmission. That number is what Buddy Martin had been telling reporters for a decade. Ronnie's skills as a driver were a gift. He was very coordinated with the hand and the foot. In addition to his shifting, his reaction times were outstanding. Everybody drove 4-speed cars at that time, and other drivers would miss gears left and right. That never happened with Ronnie. Everybody had an excuse. Ronnie could get into anyone else's car and have no problems whatsoever. Now, that's not a quote you can take at full face value when it comes from your business partner. It sounds like the kind of thing partners say about each other in old interviews when they're being generous with memory. But the Lenco Delta is not a quote. The Lenco Delta is a number. And that number says, in the most objective form drag racing can produce, that Ronnie Sox's hand and foot were faster and more efficient than the best clutchless transmission American engineering could build in 1973. The NHRA's John Jodagas later put it as cleanly as anybody ever did. Power shifting requires the hand-foot coordination of a tap-dancing juggler. The timing of the hard yank of the shift lever has to be carefully synchronized with the minimal application of the clutch pedal to prevent over-revving the engine. Sox himself, looking back on it years later, said he ran the clutch linkage real tight, used short shift levers, and that when Chrysler put computers in the car, they found he could actually shift faster than an automatic. He had total confidence in himself, and that was a huge advantage. Think about that for a second as an analogy. You know how calculators replaced mathematicians for everyday arithmetic, but the best mathematicians were still faster than early calculators at certain specific operations because they had internalized the logic at a level the machine hadn't caught up to yet? That's roughly what was happening in Pro Stock in 1973. The Lenco was the calculator. Most drivers needed it. Ronnie Sox was the mathematician who didn't. So put it all together. From 1970 through 1971, the rest of the field couldn't beat him on equal weight. NHRA changed the weight rules in 1972. The new weight rules took 90% of the gap. Then in 1973, the Lenco took the last 10. Once both pieces were in place, the rulebook and the transmission, Ronnie Sox no longer had a special advantage. He was just a really good pro stock driver in a class that no longer rewarded the things he was best at. Wayne Gap won the 1973 NHRA Pro Stock Championship. Bob Glidden won the next one and started building the dynasty that would define the late 70s. Chrysler pulled its factory pro stock support after 1973. Sox and Martin ran their Hemi Cuda and a Colt in factory experimental for a while, but the writing was on the wall. In 1975, Buddy Martin formally requested termination of the team's Chrysler contract. The split was friendly. As Martin put it later, there was never animosity between Ronnie, Jake, and me. The 4-speed pro stock car was effectively dead by the middle of the decade. By 1982, NHRA scrapped the entire pounds per cubic inch format and went to a flat 500 cubic inch, 2,350-pound formula. The class kept evolving toward the clutchless, air-shifted, electronic powertrains it runs today. Number 426 Hemi has won an NHRA Pro Stock World Championship since 1971. No 4-speed-only driver has ever come close to the kind of reputation Sox built between 1964 and 1972. Here's the thing. Sox didn't quit when the rules moved against him. After Chrysler walked, he became a hired gun. He drove a Don Hardy-built Dodge Colt for Billy Stepp's Billy the Kid team. Then a 1978 Hemi Challenger. Then a 1979 Plymouth Omni with a Don Hardy chassis and a 337 cubic inch Diamond Racing small block tuned by Chick Danino. He won at Darlington, won at Rockingham, finished runner-up at the 1979 Gator Nationals. He was 40 years old and still putting the car in the winner's circle on tracks where he'd been racing since before some of his competition was born. In 1981, he found a sanction that still rewarded him. The NHRA didn't have NHRA's hostile weight rules and was running Mountain Motor Pro Stock. Sox won the NHRA Winston World Nationals, the Northern Nationals, the Summer Nationals, and the U.S. Open. He took the 1981 NHRA Pro Stock World Championship and pushed the NHRA cars into the 7.80s for the first time. He won more NHRA races in 1982, 1985, and 1990. The man was still showing up and still winning races at an age when most drivers had long since handed the keys to somebody else. In 1995, he and Buddy Martin reunited to run a Ford Probe in NHRA. He crashed it and the wreck more or less ended his driving career. Then in 1998 they did the reunion that older fans still talk about. NHRA created a pro stock truck class and Sox and Martin came back together with a red, white, and blue Dodge Dakota. 358 cubic inch Dick Maskeen small block. Liberty 5-speed manual. As Sox told writer Jeff Burke, he had told Buddy he wanted to go NHRA truck racing and Buddy liked the idea. Look, the truck wasn't really competitive in the short-lived series. But for the people who had watched the 1971 Cuda peel front wheels off the line at Indy, seeing those two names back together on the side of a race truck felt like the right closing chapter. There was something about Sox and Martin together that was bigger than the car they were running. It was about the history, about what they represented in an era the sport was moving away from faster than most people wanted to admit. In 2001, Ronnie married his second wife Diane in Richmond, Virginia. The same year, NHRA put out its list of the top 50 drivers of all time, covering 1951 to 2000. Sox came in 15th. Bill Jenkins came in 8th. Both men had given each other their proper place in the history of the sport and neither of them seemed bitter about where the rankings landed. They were competitors who respected each other. Jenkins acknowledged Sox's shifting ability his entire career. Sox acknowledged Jenkins' engineering genius. The rivalry was clean. In a sport that could get ugly fast when money and egos and factory politics were all in the same room, the Jenkins-Sox rivalry was mostly just two very good people doing very good work and pushing each other to get better. Ronnie Sox died on April 22, 2006, in Richmond, Virginia, of prostate cancer. He was 67 years old. His funeral services were split across 2 days in Richmond and in Graham, North Carolina, and his burial is at Alamance Memorial Park in Burlington, in the same county where he had learned to feel a clutch on a 1932 Plymouth coupe more than 50 years earlier. The thread from that coupe to the 1971 Cuda to the Lenco Delta is a single continuous line. He started learning the craft as a child, and he refined it until the sport built a machine specifically to make it obsolete. The team's legacy did not die with him. Buddy Martin, still living in Fayetteville, North Carolina, served as Grand Marshal at the 2024 NHRA U.S. Nationals when the Hemi Challenge specialty race was renamed the Sox and Martin Hemi Challenge presented by the McCandless Collection. Herb McCandless's son Mike runs the McCandless Collection and the Sox and Martin brand still operates out of Burlington with apparel and merchandise. Diane Sox runs the Ronnie Sox Foundation, which donates twice a year to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Their oldest son Dean Sox, who served as Ronnie's crew chief in 1981, died of ALS in May of 2025. The 1971 Cuda survives. Sox personally authenticated the restoration in 2005, the year before his death, and the car has changed hands at high-end auctions in the years since. The 1965 altered wheelbase Hee-Haw Hemi was once owned by country singer Roy Clark and is now in private hand. The 1972 Duster is still touring. The original 1965 Paper Tiger is believed to have been parted out in the 60s. So here's where we land after all of that. Here is the full answer to the question we started with. How does one driver get so good at a stick shift that the rulebook has to be rewritten to stop him? The answer is Ronnie Sox got that good. He got that good because he started learning a clutch at 12 years old and practiced it every single day for 30 years. He got that good because he had what Buddy Martin called a gift in his hand and his foot, a physical coordination that was measurably beyond what the era's best engineering could replicate by the time anyone thought to test it. He got that good because Chrysler gave him the best 4-speed Hemi cars in America to drive, and because he had Jake King building his engines and Tom Richardson making sure the world knew about it. He got that good because Buddy Martin gave him the resources and the stability to focus entirely on the act of driving. And we know it's all true and not just legend because in 1973, when the technology finally came along that could replace him, the data said exactly one thing. Every car in the field got faster except his. Not a little slower. Not the same. Measurably, repeatably, unambiguously slower. 0.04 of a second slower in a discipline where hundredths are the margin between champions and also-rans. That number is not a story someone told at a swap meet 20 years later. That number was recorded on a timing slip on a real race day in front of real witnesses, and it has never been seriously disputed in the 50 years since. Ronnie Sox really was the human transmission. He really was better at that specific task than the machine built to automate it. And that is a thing so rare in motorsport, or in any sport for that matter, that it almost defies the framework we normally use to talk about athletic ability. Think about what it would take for that to be true in any other discipline. Imagine a pitcher so precise that radar guns started reading slower when you told him to throw without thinking about his mechanic. Imagine a sprinter who ran faster times when you took away the starting blocks because the blocks were actually slowing down his read of the gun. That's the category of thing we're talking about with the Lenco Delta. It's not that Sox was great. Plenty of drivers were great. It's that the technology designed to make great driving obsolete made him specifically slower, which means he had been operating at a level above that technology all along without anyone having a clean way to measure it. The Lenco gave the sport the first clean measurement, and what it found was a driver who had already passed the machine. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at the early Pro Stock era. The class was designed to be a driver's class. The rules were built around production-based machinery precisely because the idea was that the best driver in the best prepped legal car would win. That was the whole philosophy. It's why Jenkins and Sox and Nicholson and Landy all pushed for the class in the first place. They wanted a place where preparation and driving skill were the deciding factors, not cubic inches or exotic fuels or trick aerodynamic. Sox took that philosophy and ran it out to its logical extreme. He made his driving so good that it became the primary competitive advantage of the entire operation. Not the engine, even though Jake King's Hemis were exceptional. Not the chassis, even though Dave Christie's work was meticulous. The driver was the edge. And when NHRA changed the weight rules to accommodate the small block runners and Leonard Abbott's Lenco took the shifting variable out of the equation, the two things that had made Sox and Martin untouchable were gone simultaneously. It wasn't bad luck. It was convergence. Two separate developments arrived at the same moment and together they did what neither could have done alone. Now, you might be thinking, does any of this matter 50 years later? It's an interesting history. But what does it actually mean beyond one team's story? And look, that's a fair question. Here's the answer. It matters because the story of Ronnie Sox is really a story about what happens when a human skill reaches its absolute ceiling at exactly the moment technology catches up to it. That intersection is one of the rarest things in sport. We talk constantly about athletes who were ahead of their time. We almost never talk about athletes who were precisely of their time, who reached the maximum possible expression of a skill set in the exact window when that skill set was both possible and relevant. Ronnie Sox didn't get there a decade too early or a decade too late. He arrived at the top of a craft in the years when that craft was the most consequential variable in his sport, and he held that position until two external developments simultaneously closed the window. That's not a tragedy. That's actually a kind of perfection. The cars survive. The records are in the books. The Hemi Challenge at the U.S. Nationals carries their name. The Sox and Martin Foundation sends money to sick kids twice a year. And somewhere in a collection or a garage or a climate-controlled storage facility, there's a 1971 Cuda with a short-throw Hurst shifter and an A833 4-speed, and if you know the history, you know that the most important component in that car was never the Hemi. It was the hands behind the wheel. In the small ways the sport remembers, in the renamed Hemi Challenge at Indy, in the surviving Cudas, in the foundation Diane Sox runs in his name, in the way old Pro Stock guys still light up when his name comes up at a swap meet, the human transmission still gets the credit he earned. And that 0.04 of a second on a timing slip in the spring of 1973 is still there, quiet and precise and permanent, the most honest thing drag racing ever said about Ronnie Sox.